Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving deep into sermons on Luke 18, 1-8.
Oh, yeah.
I guess.
Persistent widow.
What you're thinking.
Right.
Not the persistent widow again.
Yeah.
But stick with us, because we dug deep. We found some unique interpretations and illustrations that go way beyond the surface level.
Yeah, it's amazing what you find when you go looking for it.
So let's jump right in. What were some of the less obvious things pastors are presenting on this?
Well, one interesting thread we noticed was how some pastors connected persistent prayer to the second coming. Like Creekside Community Church in Colorado highlighted this. It suggests that even when things seem unfair now, there's a future reckoning where God will set things right.
So it's like the widow isn't just fighting for herself.
Right.
She's a symbol of all those who long for God's ultimate justice to prevail.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see how that adds a different dimension.
And then you have churches like High Ridge who took a totally different approach.
Right.
They framed prayer as an active participation in God's kingdom, not just a passive activity.
So it's not just about asking, but about doing.
Right. It challenges us to ask ourselves, how does my prayer life inform my actions?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
It really pushes us beyond a purely transactional view of prayer. It makes us think about how our prayers and actions should be working together.
Yeah.
Like that.
And the Nipawin Apostolic Church really grabbed my attention.
Okay.
They emphasized shameless audacity in prayer.
Shameless audacity.
Yeah, they encouraged their congregation to be bold and even demanding, like the widow in the parable.
That's pretty different from the usual image of quiet, humble supplication.
Yeah, it's a bold approach.
Does that contradict other teachings about approaching God with reverence and humility?
It certainly challenges some traditional views, but they argue that just as the widow refused to be ignored, we shouldn't be afraid to persistently and passionately plead our case before God.
I see their point.
Yeah.
Persistence requires boldness, but how do they balance this audacity with humility?
That's a great question, and maybe we can explore that more in part 2.
Okay, let's put a pin in that.
For now, let's shift gears to something that we found particularly interesting. The unique sermon illustrations pastors are using to bring Luke 18, 1-8 to life.
Yeah, sometimes you need that perfect analogy to make a concept really stick.
Exactly.
What were some of the most memorable illustrations you came across?
One that stood out to me was from First Baptist Church in Crane, Texas. They compared persistent prayer to the dedication of a college basketball player who sticks with a team for years, even through challenges.
So just like an athlete trains day after day,
right,
prayer requires that same kind of consistent effort.
Exactly. It emphasizes that long-term commitment, that refusal to give up, even when we don't see immediate results.
Yeah, it reminds us that those breakthroughs sometimes come after years of faithfulness.
Absolutely. And it's relatable. You know, people understand that long-term dedication.
Any other illustrations catch your eye?
River City Community Church had a really relatable one, comparing persistent prayer to learning to swim without a floaty.
Oh, I remember that feeling.
Yeah.
That initial fear, and then the tentative trust. And finally, that moment of realizing you can stay afloat on your own.
Right.
How does that connect to prayer?
It's about that feeling of letting go.
Okay.
Trusting in something bigger than ourselves.
Right.
Even when it feels scary. It's about surrendering control and relying on God's strength to carry us through.
Okay, so it's for those who are going through a difficult time and feel like they're drowning in their circumstances.
Exactly.
Were there any illustrations that were a little bit more...
lighthearted?
Lighthearted.
Well, remember Nipawin Apostolic Church with their shameless audacity?
Yeah.
Their illustration was a dog with laser focus on a jar of peanut butter.
Oh, yeah, I can picture it.
Yeah.
Unwavering focus.
Nothing could distract him.
How does a peanut butter-loving dog connect to prayer?
Well, it might sound funny.
Yeah.
But it brilliantly captures that unwavering determination we need in prayer.
Okay.
That single-minded focus, even if it looks a little undignified from the outside.
Yeah, I love that.
So we got some thought-provoking interpretations.
Yeah.
Relatable illustrations.
What else are these pastors doing to make this familiar parable feel fresh?
Well, a lot of them are digging into the historical context to add depth and nuance to their interpretations. Like Creekside Community Church highlighted the vulnerability of widows in the first century. They had very limited rights and often faced exploitation.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to gloss over that detail, but it really changes how we see the widow's persistence.
Right.
She's not just being a nuisance. She's bravely fighting for her survival
Yeah.
in a system that's rigged against her.
And River City Community Church explained how judges were often corrupt,
Oh, wow.
requiring bribes to even consider a case.
So the widow wasn't just facing apathy.
Nope.
She was up against a system designed to silence those
Yeah.
without power or resources.
Exactly.
Wow, this historical context adds a whole new layer.
It does, doesn't it?
It's not just a quaint story about prayer, it's a commentary on social injustice and the abuse of power.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how that same dynamic might be playing out in our world today.
Yeah, who are the widows in our society today?
Exactly.
Crying out for justice.
And that reminds us that our prayers should not just be about our personal needs, but also about the needs of those who are marginalized and oppressed.
That's a great point.
We'll delve even further into those themes of social justice and prophetic witness in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, yeah, wait. We'll be right back with more insightful perspectives on Luke 18, 1-8, after a quick break.
Sounds good. Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we've been exploring all these creative interpretations and illustrations pastors are using, and it really highlights how this parable can speak to us on so many levels.
It does, and we left off talking about the historical context of the parable.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some pastors are connecting it to broader themes of social justice.
Right.
How are they making that connection?
Well, First Congregational Church of Redlands, for instance, linked the widow's persistence to the cries of prophets like Habakkuk, who challenged injustice and oppression in their own time.
Right.
They highlighted how this parable speaks to the timeless struggle against injustice, no matter the context.
So they're saying that the widow's story isn't just a historical anecdote, but a model for how we should respond to injustice in our own time.
Exactly. They're encouraging their congregations to see themselves as advocates for those who are marginalized and voiceless.
Okay.
To be persistent in fighting for what's right, even when it seems impossible.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
It challenges us to move beyond simply praying for those in need and actually take action to address the root causes of injustice.
Right, and it reminds us that prayer and action should go hand in hand.
Okay, so it's not either.
Exactly.
So we've got these unique interpretations, the powerful illustrations, and the historical context. What other threads are emerging from these sermons on Luke 18, 1-8?
One thing that keeps coming up is this idea of wrestling with God in prayer.
Wrestling with God.
Yeah.
That sounds intense.
It can be.
What do they mean by that?
It's about that deep internal struggle we sometimes experience when we feel like our prayers aren't being answered. You know, when we're questioning God's timing, His plan even, His goodness.
Yeah. So those moments of doubt,
Yeah.
those dark nights of the soul, when we feel alone and unheard,
Right.
aren't pastors supposed to offer comfort and reassurance?
Yeah.
Not encourage wrestling?
Well, it's not about encouraging doubt,
Okay.
but acknowledging it.
Okay.
And that's where Symphony Church's use of Psalm 13 was really interesting. They quoted David's cry to God, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever?" You know, he's pouring out his raw emotions, his frustration, his questioning.
So they're showing that even a giant of faith like David had those moments of wrestling with God.
Exactly. And they're normalizing those feelings for their congregations, showing them that it's okay to question, to struggle, to wrestle with God. It's part of a genuine faith journey.
So it's not a sign of weak faith, but of an honest, authentic relationship with God.
Right.
Okay. I see how that could be comforting.
Yeah.
What other angles did you see pastors taking on this idea of struggle and wrestling?
Well, another interesting connection pastors are making is between persistent prayer and spiritual warfare.
Spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
Okay, now that sounds pretty epic.
It is in a sense.
What does that look like in practice?
It's not about literal battles with demons,
Okay.
but about recognizing that there are forces at work in the world that oppose God's will. Nippo and Apostolic Church, for example, talked about how the widow's persistence is a model for us in this spiritual struggle.
So we need to be just as bold and relentless in our prayers as the widow was in her pursuit of justice.
Exactly. It takes courage to stand firm, to refuse to back down, to keep knocking on heaven's door until it opens.
This is making prayer sound a lot more active and even confrontational than how we usually think about it.
It is a call to action in a way.
Right.
And, you know, this ties back to the idea of shameless audacity we talked about earlier.
Right.
It takes a certain boldness, a willingness to be persistent, even when it feels uncomfortable.
But doesn't that boldness sometimes border on disrespect?
That's a good point.
Where's the line between persistence and demanding our own way?
That's a great question, and it's one that these pastors grapple with as well.
Right.
But it's an important conversation to have because it pushes us to think about the nature of our relationship with God.
So we've got wrestling with God, spiritual warfare.
Yeah,
This is heavy stuff.
it is.
Are there any pastors offering a lighter approach?
Well, alongside those weighty themes, we're also seeing a lot of pastors using secular illustrations to make these spiritual concepts more accessible and relatable.
Okay.
Remember that illustration about learning to swim without a floaty?
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Well, there were so many others. For example, Worth Baptist Church used the very relatable frustration of traffic delays and
Right.
airline delays.
Oh, yeah, I've been there,
Yeah.
waiting impatiently for things to get moving.
Right.
But how did they tie that into prayer?
They connected that frustration to the experience of waiting for answers to our prayers.
Okay.
Sometimes it feels like God is delaying and we get impatient and start questioning.
So the takeaway is that those times of waiting,
Yeah.
while frustrating, might actually be part of God's plan.
Exactly. And they can be opportunities for growth and refinement, for learning to trust in God's timing, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
It's a good reminder that God's delays are not denials.
Mm-hmm.
He's working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it.
Right.
Are there any other secular illustrations that stood out?
Well, Bethel Baptist Church shared a quote from Charles Spurgeon,
Okay.
who said he rarely goes 12 minutes without praying and rarely prays for over 12 minutes.
That's interesting. So he's weaving prayer into the fabric of his day, not just setting aside one block at a time.
Exactly. It's about those quick check-ins with God throughout the day, those moments of gratitude, those
Right.
quick cries for help when we need it.
It makes prayer feel more accessible,
Right.
less like a formal obligation.
Exactly.
Any other practical advice from these pastors?
High Ridge Church used a great analogy comparing prayer to taking vitamins and painkillers.
We talked about that one earlier.
We did.
Really like that analogy.
It's a good one.
We need those daily vitamins of prayer to nourish our souls.
Right.
But we also need those emergency painkillers when we're facing a crisis or challenge.
Exactly. And it reminds us that prayer is both a preventative measure and a source of strength in times of need.
So we've got wrestling, spiritual warfare, secular illustrations, and practical advice.
Mm-hmm.
What else are these pastors emphasizing in their sermons?
Well, one of the most important takeaways from all these sermons is that prayer is not a solo sport.
Right.
It's about finding community, praying with others, supporting each other on this journey of faith.
Makes sense. It's about sharing our burdens, celebrating our victories, and drawing strength from the collective faith of the body of Christ.
Exactly.
Did any of the pastors offer specific examples of how to foster this community aspect of prayer?
Well, several churches talked about the importance of small group prayer meetings where people can share their requests and pray for each other.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
It creates a safe space for vulnerability and allows people to experience the power of prayer in a more intimate setting.
Right.
Anything else?
Others encourage their congregations to find prayer partners,
Oh.
people they can connect with regularly for prayer and support.
Having someone to pray with, to hold you accountable, and to encourage you when you're feeling weak can make all the difference.
Absolutely, because when we come together in prayer, we tap into a power that's far greater than ourselves.
So it's like those strands of a rope.
Yeah.
Individually, they might be weak, but woven together, they become incredibly strong.
Exactly.
This has been so insightful. We've uncovered so many layers of meaning in this seemingly simple parable.
Yeah, me too.
But I have a feeling there's even more to explore, right?
You bet these pastors are a bottomless well of wisdom and insight,
Okay.
and we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, then let's keep digging. We'll be right back with more fascinating insights from our deep dive into Luke 18, 1-8. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been unpacking these incredible sermons on Luke 18, 1-8. It's amazing how many layers there are to this parable.
It really is.
We've talked about wrestling with God, spiritual warfare, social justice,
Right.
even those clever illustrations that bring it all to life.
Yeah.
What other gems did you find in these sermons?
Well, one theme that really struck me was this emphasis on prayer as a transformative practice.
Transformative.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
It's not just about presenting our wish list to God.
Yeah.
It's about allowing prayer to change us,
Okay.
to shape our hearts and minds,
Right.
to align us more closely with God's will.
So prayer is less about getting what we want and more about becoming who we're meant to be.
Exactly. And several pastors highlighted how persistent prayer in particular can cultivate virtues
Okay.
like patience, perseverance, and trust in God's timing.
It's about surrendering our own agenda
Yeah,
and embracing God's plan even when it doesn't make sense to us.
right.
Did any of the pastors offer specific examples of how this transformation plays out in real life?
Oh, absolutely. Okay.
One pastor talked about how persistent prayer helped him overcome a deep-seated resentment he was holding on to.
Mm-hmm.
Through prayer, he was able to see the situation from a different perspective
Okay.
and eventually forgive the person who had hurt him.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how prayer can really change our hearts and minds.
Yeah, it
It's not just about words,
Right.
but about a deep inner work that God does through prayer.
Exactly. It's about aligning our desires with God's desires, and that often requires a shift in our thinking,
Yeah.
our attitudes, even our core beliefs.
You know, aside from this transformative aspect, I was struck by how many of these pastors focused on the practical side of prayer.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people struggle with the how-to,
Yeah,
so that practical advice can be really valuable.
absolutely.
What were some of the tips and strategies they shared?
Well, Bethel Baptist Church shared a quote from Charles Spurgeon that really stuck with me.
Okay.
He said he rarely goes 12 minutes without praying and rarely prays for over 12 minutes.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So it's not about long, drawn-out prayer sessions,
Right.
but about weaving prayer into the fabric of your day.
Exactly. It's about finding those little pockets of time throughout the day to connect with God.
Okay.
Whether it's a quick prayer of gratitude or a cry for help when you're feeling overwhelmed.
I like that.
Yeah.
It makes prayer feel less intimidating, more like an ongoing conversation with a close friend.
Right?
What other practical advice did you come across?
High Ridge Church had a great analogy comparing prayer to taking vitamins and painkillers.
Oh, we talked about that one earlier.
We did. It's a good
I
one.
really like that analogy.
Mhm.
We need those daily vitamins of prayer to nourish our souls.
Right.
But we also need those emergency painkillers when we're facing a crisis or challenge.
Exactly. It reminds us that prayer is both preventative and restorative. It keeps us spiritually healthy,
Mhm.
but it's also there to help us when we're hurting.
And, one of the most consistent messages across all these sermons was the importance of community in prayer.
Yeah.
That resonates with what we were discussing earlier about prayer not being a solo sport.
Right.
Did the pastors suggest any specific ways to cultivate that community aspect of prayer?
Several churches talked about small group prayer meetings where people can share their requests and pray for each other.
That's a great way to create a safe space for vulnerability,
Yeah.
to experience the power of praying together.
Right.
Did any of the pastors mention other approaches?
Yeah, a few emphasize the importance of finding a prayer partner, someone you can connect with regularly, to pray for each other's needs and offer support and encouragement.
I love that having someone to journey with you in prayer can make all the difference, especially when you're going through a difficult time.
Exactly. It's about bearing each other's burdens, celebrating each other's victories, and drawing strength from the collective faith of the body of Christ. Because when we come together in prayer, we tap into a power that's far greater than ourselves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Luke 18, 1-8,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's this. Never underestimate the power of persistent prayer. It can move mountains, change hearts, and bring about God's justice in ways we can't even imagine.
It's about believing that God hears us, that he cares, and that he is working behind the scenes even when it doesn't feel like it. And it's about being persistent in our pursuit of God's will, in our fight for justice, and in our own personal transformation.
Beautifully said. Keep praying, keep believing, and keep trusting in God's perfect timing.
And with that, we'll leave you to ponder the depths of this powerful parable. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.